Oi, what's up? I really wanted to open that up with a more classical Aussie slang, but I talked with Nablime yesterday when he was in the stream chat, and he said he doesn't actually say that famous word from the Aussie language. So apparently he does. Yeah, he just doesn't say it often. He keeps it very specific for specific situations, like perhaps winning a trophy. Oh shit! Well, Nablime is the champion of Ascension number 7. We're going to be talking about Ascension number 7, the latest and greatest tournament for Cosmonarchy Brood War. Of course, we'll recap that. We'll talk about CMBW's balance updates and some considerations that I've got going on. We'll talk about the Underclass group stage tournament that we want to run. It's going to be like a one-day only thing probably. And we'll also talk a little bit about what we're planning on doing with the rest of December. The immediate focuses that we have over here at the No Frauds Club. And following that, of course, we'll be answering some coffee questions because it's an episode of Prototype, and it just wouldn't be right if it didn't have some coffee questions. If you like what we're doing around here, if you appreciated the tournament or what have you, you can send in some big fat donos using that coffee link in the description. And without further ado, let's get into it. Ascension number 7 was the most involved tournament that I have run to date. It's not just because of the gauntlet, which itself took about 2 weeks in order to run, and it was a lot of sort of ad hoc casting. There was a day I had to say, hey guys, at work, my part-time day job, so to speak, I'm going to be late because Newt and Veek are about to go into Game 5. And then actually I wasn't that late because it was a fast Ackmed push. But that was in the gauntlet phase, right? That was crazy. Then we end up seeing, the group stage itself, another 12-hour day. I mean, we're kind of used to that because 5 and 6, those tournaments were both 12-hour days or thereabouts as far as the group stage goes. And it's really cool to see the level of power, the level of, performance, I guess, rise up. And we're finding players that are breaking the game in new and exciting ways. And it might not be too exciting if you are a StarCraft 2 Grandmaster streamer. Upsaya. And it might be more like tilt-worthy and explosive. But that's okay, homie, because, we're just finding out all the busted stuff. And it seems like the core aspects of the project are compelling enough that despite how busted some of this stuff seems to be, people are still interested in giving it a shout. And of course, we'll talk a little bit about my thoughts on the busted stuff in the next section of this very episode. But I thought what was really remarkable about this tournament, besides the fact that, of course, it was very draining, I was definitely sort of burning the candle at both ends, trying to make sure everything was run, getting everybody scheduled. I didn't sleep the full 8 hours in many of the days of, especially the last week, but just in general, definitely trying to make sure people could get their games in. And I was really happy that we were able to play all 3 of the final series live. I felt like that gave us a lot of gravitas to that final day of play, but that wasn't a guarantee either. And so it was just like, I'm very grateful that the schedule sort of worked out that way. And, there's a load of different things that we might do differently next time around. We've got a lot of time to consider our options and think about what we're doing. But I definitely feel like the tournaments were, I guess it's kind of like a mixed bag, because on the one hand, right, I think they were a great success in the way that they added spectacle. They, drew the community together, and news spread far and wide that people are running tournaments to begin with. And then, people were interested in playing in them and watching them and all that stuff. But also it definitely took time and focus away from single player content, cooperative content. You can even just say like general tech tree development in some ways, because like there's certain units that still aren't implemented. There's certain engine features that haven't been wrangled yet. And some of those engine features that we are going to wrangle are actually, they've become a priority because of the tournament. And so that's kind of where I'm saying it's a bit of a mixed bag. It's like, I don't think that we would have gotten as much interest and specifically like feedback from competitive players if it weren't for these ongoing tournaments. Because I think if the tournaments never happened, or if they were only kind of like a one-off, like, oh yeah, I guess we just have Ascension number 1 and Mystery meets the champion and whatever. That's cool. But like we saw some significant meta shifting and development such that like the game wasn't as defined by cheese. Like progressively each tournament we saw more and more macro games. We saw more and more tier 3 hits. And, that was a lot more compelling as a result, because you get to see more of the game that way. Of course, you can still say that like maybe Zerg was defined by cheese, but like broadly speaking, we did see more. I think we saw a lot more in the sense of like, you just get better output or whatever from the response of like, this is the game feels better to play. It like feels more balanced, feels more reasonable when you're dealing with the numbers of things that you can handle that have been balanced around some form of competitive play with like some kind of data ingested and metabolized by whoever's pulling the punches. And in this case, it was me, but it was also the community providing a lot of feedback. And I know that like feedback itself, I sort of spoke about this when I was discussing the balance implications and stuff in yesterday's stream. I'm recording this for clarity's sake on the 18th, and I did do a almost 5 hour stream on Monday the 17th, or I guess Sunday the 17th rather, working on all sorts of different details about the balance. And so I know that my take on balancing being very conservative about certain details is definitely one of those things where it's like, it can be frustrating. It's like, well, no, this is really busted, and like changing one stat about it is not going to fix it or whatever. But it's like, well, the big thing that was really remarkable to me about the tournament is that we saw the player driven engagement actually set the meta. It wasn't balance changes. Like a lot of the balance changes that happened in between like the gauntlet stage, for example, and the group stage, it was like, I guess technically it definitely touched some of the Protoss matchups from the Ardent Authority units, because like and I guess like Drakodons in general, and certain units just got a little bit more like easier to move around and stuff. But beyond that, it was also like, I'm looking at, for example, the cataphract changes. It's like, well, we didn't really see those that often because there were only 3 Terrans that made it into the tournament total, since Mystery Meat had to drop out. And so, and everybody was favoring Bio anyway, right? So it was kind of like, yeah, we saw it a couple of times, but not that much. And so I don't think we really got a chance to even get a read on whether or not those changes were too impactful. And also, I'm not so certain that the Protoss like specifically won. A lot of Protoss versus Protoss matches happened in this tournament. And I'm not so sure that the Protoss versus not Protoss matches were like swayed by the architect usage specifically. Like it was still a dominant unit, and I think it still would have been a dominant unit no matter what. Even if it hadn't become a little bit more user-friendly, you could say, with the way that it was resolved as far as handling is concerned. So anyway, like balance changes aside and stuff, like over the course of the tournament, there was nothing that targeted Gateway and Quasith Pool units, and yet PvZ was defined by the Zerg being able to get so many advantages over Gateway Protoss that it didn't really end up being that significant of like, it felt like there was a huge balance change, right? And then there was just nothing. It was like, there wasn't actually a balance change. It was just people coming up with different tactics. And I thought that was really cool. It was something that I hadn't seen to that degree before in the context of the like Cosmonarchy Brood War. And I have like, the only time I've really seen that in the past in general is like Brood War, right? Because it's like, or I guess like in a abstract way, I can map on certain Counter-Strike meta shifts, because that game doesn't get changed too often. If there's changes, it might be map changes, but there's not very frequent, balance changes, right? Or economy system changes or whatever. So certain like details about the game, like really it is balanced through maps predominantly. And even then it's like you get to play both halves. So it's not like it would sort of be like if you played as Zerg, like say you played a best of 3 and each game you changed races or something. Like that's not even exactly mappable to see how Counter-Strike works, but that's sort of what I'm getting at, is like you're all able to use each other's, sides or whatever. Like you can use you get like full parity and full usage of the tools. So it's a lot more balanced in that sense, I guess, where it's like you can be like a really good, offensive team, T-side team, but you might not be so good on the defense, and vice versa, right? So that's kind of like, if you're a good Zerg player but not a Terran player, except you keep, like, there's no such thing as only playing on the T-side. So it's not quite the same thing, but hopefully it's understandable. So yeah, anyway, like generally speaking, I haven't seen that kind of event occur where players are the ones driving the meta shift. And I think it's really cool when that happens. It's actually a little bit of a point of pride for me that is something that happened at all. And it shows that people are trying to take the project seriously enough in terms of the competitive side, right? So hopefully, as a result of that, we'll find even more things that maybe need adjustment or maybe just demand a response from the from the other side. In this case, I was about to say from the Protoss side, but obviously this is just like the one specific example. Is like, can Protoss respond to this gateway counter that is being deployed by Zerg players? Well, obviously we are going to see some balance changes, right? But beyond that, it would be interesting if like we need to see how things settle out, right? And it seems like an obvious thing to say, and I think it kind of is an obvious thing to say, but it's just not something that you see that often in the context of really, I don't know, like I don't see RTS games have player-driven metas in general. And maybe it's like I'm just dismissing what is there. I'm not really like appreciating what is there about those RTS games and what metas they have. But it does feel like the developers really like to enforce certain things. And I'm no different in some ways. Like, I want to enforce certain details, similar to how Veek wants to enforce certain details. It's like, I just want the game to be played in the sense that you can play macro and you may build an army and you come up with a strategy, you create a composition, you take a base, you take many bases, ideally, the longer the game goes on, and you look for like lethality and stuff. But I think you also need to have the ability to have lethality in the early stages of the game. I wouldn't want it to be a foregone conclusion that every game can last, for example, 10 minutes, but it shouldn't be like 10 minutes is the apex or whatever, right? So if we got to the point where like high-level players were developing this really volatile meta back and forth where neither of them would ever get to tier 2 stuff because they would just close the game in between 6 and 10 minutes, that's like an area where I think, okay, is there any player meta that can resolve that? Or are we just stuck in that until I make some sort of balance change that increases defensibility? So that's like its own thing, right? But when it comes to the way that I've seen the game be shifted, I do think that Ascension number 7 had some of the more memorable games. I definitely think like the screenshot that I have for this episode is from the fifth match, the fifth map of the best of 7 grand finals that we had between Hamster and Nablime. And at this point, Hamster is up 3-1. And could have won the whole tournament here. But this map, Nitro Valley, that was the tipping point in the series, I think. That's when he gassed out. Because earlier, in fact, I was going back and forth as to whether or not I wanted to show like the cool tier 2 snazzy stuff, which is what I got here. Although you can thank YouTube compression for why it's goofy. But I also was debating showing like the really deadly looking push up the, with the Zeth flood basically. And it's like, okay, dude, that could have ended him. And if Nablime lost there, if he lost his foothold or, he lost his ministry or something, like that probably in the long arm of the game, the long arc of the game ends up being something where Hamster just takes it. But he just like barely holds on and that allows him to get through the rest. So I don't know. That was really cool. It was like a defining moment of the whole set, and I can't believe Hamster's run. The fact that he got within like tournament point, championship point, and just wasn't able to summon up enough extra strength to win one more match. Man, I was so shocked, and part of it is definitely like fatigue, right, setting in where he had to play 2 other series before then, and I don't know if he had slept between his series against Hapsea where they were doing practice. But it was definitely very interesting. I don't know. It's interesting stuff. But either way, I'm looking at this. I'm looking at like the sort of tournament in aggregate, and I just feel like there is some really cool things that happened. I'm very much appreciative of how the series overall went. All of the series that we had. There's not really a plural for series. Like you can't say series is. Anyway, I'm really happy about how the matches went. I think it was a really cool spectacle. Obviously, there's going to be some people in Hamster's court like, bro, you had to play 3 series and you almost won the tournament. Nablime only had to rock up and play 1. Like, that's crazy. You were obviously the better player. And then there's going to be some haters who are like, bro, you're Zerg. You still couldn't win. What the fuck? So, like, I don't know. I don't know where the populace comes down on that. But that's another thing that we might consider, right? Is like, should you only have to play max 2 series in one day? Like that's a fair, open, question for us. But I think if we're going to keep the normalization of like the last 3 matches get played in the same day, and you do make that legendary run that Hamster did, I think, no, honestly, like if you're stuck in elimination 3, if you're stuck in the earlier stages of the lower bracket, like there's something Herculean about that, where you just have to keep playing. And again, holy shit, he almost did it. Like, that was incredibly memorable for my money. But I understand that this is something that other people may disagree about. So I'm open to hearing the thoughts on that one. But just for me, that's what it's like. It should be, in my opinion, very stacked against you as far as the odds are concerned. So maybe that's too much. We'll have to wait and see. But nonetheless, obviously that does mean that Nibelheim takes the trophy and he rocks up and wins. Wins one for Ozzy. He's got one on his name. You can click on his profile. You'll see that role there, Ascension number 7 champ. And, it's Mystery Meat couldn't stack yet another one because he just wasn't there. I hope he's doing well. So I hope everything is going well for him. I don't know any details about why he wasn't available. He just said that he wasn't going to be at his computer, and he said rip or something like that. I was like, oh shit. That's usually what people they say RIP, just as sort of like F in the chat, it's kind of the same thing. But it's I have no idea why, but it sounds like it probably wasn't intentional or something that he was planning, clearly, because it was last second. So hopefully he's okay. And hopefully things are looking better. And I really want to see him roll through the gauntlet, because that's something I discussed with Nibelheim and the, Mesk and I talked about in the winner's interview at the end, is Mystery Meat has to go through the gauntlet to make it all the way to the next tournament. And it's pretty likely he will. But that's going to be a spectacle in and of itself, especially if you get somebody I always got to shout out my homie Box Trade, dude. That guy signed up for the gauntlet with 1 day of experience, and then the gauntlet started the very next day or something like that. I think that was what it is. He might have had 3 days, or he might have had 2 days, and it was his third day playing the project that he played the tournament, the first gauntlet match, which was really surprising. And I think he might have even played the second gauntlet match against Dead Infested, where he defeated him 2-1 in the same day, if I'm not mistaken. I know at some point he opened his campaign against iSarcasm. That was an 0-2. And then he 2-1 Dead Infested, and then he lost 1-2 to Benza. But even taking a game versus Benza is oh shit, okay, you're no joker, sir. In the future, we should follow your career for sure. I don't know if he's going to be, he hasn't played any since, as far as I know. I don't know if he's going to be interested, but it would absolutely be something that I would like to see in the context of, just having more people like that, right? Either C rank or around there, as far as your, StarCraft 1 skill level is concerned, your rank is concerned, is always cool to see. And I also think that as we get more, further along when it comes to the installation process, the setup process, the update process, and maybe we can hopefully get that BattleNet server on so we don't need Radmin anymore and stuff like that. I think that hopefully we can secure the interest of higher ranked players because it'll just be easier to spread the word in general. And so we'll probably secure the interest of many new players. And as a result of expanding the number, obviously we're going to get a higher mass volume of players, then some percentage of those will be higher level players in general, right? So in time for the next tournament, be it in February or March or whatever. So yeah, we're not even 100% sure when the next tournament is going to be, the next mainline 1v1 tournament. We really do want to spend a lot of time on content and polish and graphics and, of course, technicals. So you can definitely stay tuned for that. I know that some people have left it sort of open, I think at least one person was wondering, actually vocalize. I can't remember who it was, unfortunately. It might have been 3Crow or somebody else, but somebody was wondering, vocalizing the wonder of, hey, what happens if, are the Ascozi going to be available in the next tournament? I don't think so, because it is going to take some time to generate a first draft version of the Ascozi tech tree and then make sure that it's reasonably balanced. So I don't think they'll be available for the 8th tournament, but I mean, who knows? We'll see how fast development really goes. It's definitely something that could happen. So just a little teaser there as we close out the Ascension number 7 recap. We learned a lot about the game state. We learned a lot about, the format, I guess, certain details of, we got more impressions and more data, more feedback about certain details of the format, certain details of the game. And I definitely think that it's more food for thought. It's more stuff for me to think about and, again, metabolize and come up with some sort of response in the near future, or perhaps the far future, depending on how long it takes us to get that next tournament up and running. Indeed, let's move on to talking about balance updates and considerations. This is going to be, I'm sure, some people's favorite sections and other people's least interesting sections. And of course, that's why I timestamp these things. But the main issue that I personally took watching the games was definitely the like that double pair of Nath sort of opener that I can't even really call it a cheese because it's pretty easy to transition out of, that Hamster did to Hapsea on Highwater. And, it makes a lot of sense. The theory behind it checks out. But I think clearly that is probably a step too far, the fact that that's possible. But let's be real. To delay it would mean, either delaying the pool or more likely changing the Nathracor. And if you made it more expensive, then it just would never be made. That's the thing, right? Is the air unit timing can be really deadly, but only because there's nothing for it to fight. Whereas if you build like 40 Nathracors in the mid game or something, before tier 2, or 40 is probably an exaggeration, but like if you build a large number of them, they are scary. And if I make it so that they're more expensive, then I would have to make them more individually scary, which just means that you have more cases where the units can die, disgusting deaths in the early game, where if you rush them out, they become still pretty powerful. You know what I mean? It just kind of shifts the goalpost. So I think if we keep the unit relatively similar to how it currently is, but make it so that you are gated behind some additional purchase in order to get them, I think that's the way to do it. So there's been a number of cases where, like people have taken issue with like tier 1 Zerg having flying units, but on every single structure. And another thing that's come up, of course, is the dominance of the Vorvricor. Now, I think there's a number of things that hit the Vorvricor recently that I'm not 100% sure about, right? Because on the one hand, I normalize their movement speed so that they have faster base movement speed to match the Zethracore, but they lose their steroid when moving towards enemy units, which is basically like an easy mode surround, right? Now, it could be that the Vorvricor should have a higher base movement speed than the Zethracore, which would allow it to still have that catch-up potential, but not just arbitrarily increasing it when they move towards an enemy. I mean, it's not arbitrary, but you get the idea. And then in that particular capacity, it's like, okay, well, maybe we can think about that. But Ensnare was also not actually accurate to the tooltip. So the Ensnare debuff was slowing movement speed by 50%, but attack speed only by 25%. So I've made it slow both by 33% in the code. At least I think I have. I was never much of a mathematician when it comes to percentages and all this other stuff, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. And on pre-release, you can see all of the current changes. And the Vorvricor itself, as a result, it reduces the DPS of enemy units more significantly, but it doesn't have the same catch potential because it only slows them for 33% as opposed to 50%, right? So the reduction is 1/3 as opposed to half. And that's a pretty good metric for like, okay, the unit is definitely going to be different. In some ways it's stronger for, if you're standing and fighting it, but if you're trying to fall away from it, it's a little bit weaker, right? You can't quite make the full surround, especially with the lack of general movement speed. So we'll think about that. We'll evaluate the performance of the Vorvricor overall. But the key detail here is that it is now like a more consistently placed tier 1.5 unit because there is a mutation of the Quasith pool. Currently, we're calling it the Nathrok Lake, but that will end up changing almost certainly. And this unlocks the Nathracor from the larva and the Vorvricor from the Zethracore. So if you want to get those units, you have to pay a bit of a premium. Now, I've been adjusting the price points. Initially, it was 100 of each resource in 30 seconds. It's still 30 seconds now, but my next draft of that is 50 minerals and 100 gas. So it's still gas heavy, but it's not as expensive for the minerals' sake because you already spent 200 on the pool anyway. The Hydrith then got a similar treatment, by the way. It can now mutate into the Skithrock Scab to unlock the Skithracor, which otherwise has not received any changes as far as Oh, no, actually, it's 100 minerals and 25 gas, so it's cheaper on gas, which might make it really, really spammable. So I'm not 100% sure about that. Like, it might need to be 125 minerals or something like that, or it might need to be adjusted in some other way. Like, people are saying maybe give it a dedicated anti-air function, and I wouldn't mind that since you have to spend a healthy amount of money. Again, initially, this was 200 of each resource and 45 seconds, but I have since reduced the price to 75 minerals, 150 gas, and 40 seconds. So that is the current going rate, but again, that could change maybe by the time you're listening to this. We're still evaluating that based on some games, and I was able to watch some pretty reasonable games between Anansi and iSarcasm. Anansi being a player who has not made a tournament debut, but he joined in the middle of Ascension number 7 at the behest of Hapsea, and is a StarCraft 2 Masters Zerg player who has been translating his skills over and enjoying it, and definitely has his own opinions and thoughts and stuff. He was actually providing us some graphs, but it was based on unfortunately not quite accurate sort of value for when it comes to like how many resources you can harvest. And I think I don't know if that's actually what gave him the figures that he had, but he essentially was looking at he was using like ChatGPT and some other things to build like graphs. He showed a stream VOD of it. I'll try to remember to link it in the description so that other people can make up their own minds about it. But judging by the way that the Protoss setup and the Terran setup that he had, it was using the AI at least in some part to inform his opinions. And it's like obviously they have that resource multiplier, right? So I don't think it's entirely bunk, but he was making some points about the macro and the fact that Zerg probably need more larvae. I think that because he wasn't taking into account the AI resource multiplier for general feel of the game, and he also wasn't taking into account a more accurate to real world scenario mineral income rate. He's a little bit far behind. Also, like the Mystery Meat was doing some testing himself and saw that like if Zerg versus Terran AI, for example, they have the same resources mined at the end of the day. So like that might be Zerg just not spending as many larvae on basically on anything other than workers, and they don't spend as many workers on buildings as they should. That could be the answer there. Like there's more data that needs to be looked into, but basically he was making the argument that the reason why Zerg was relying so much on cheese and like weird play in the beginning of the game is because they don't actually have an even economy until after 6 minutes when they start to catch up and supersede on worker count. And maybe that's true. I'm definitely open to the idea. I'm also open to the idea that maybe we should start them off with 2 or 3 larvae from every larva source, so that when you make a Hatcherosk, it gives you 2 larvae instead of 1, or 3 larvae instead of 1. And also, if I'm also open to the idea that maybe we only need to do that for the very first structure, as opposed to all structures that you make. I don't necessarily hate the idea, so it's just a question of, what do we do about that? I'm pretty sure you start off with 3 larvae in StarCraft 1 by default, but obviously you only start off with 50 minerals. So, that's its own thing. This means that if we did give the Zerg more larvae in the start, they would obviously be able to immediately get a second worker. Now, I think that that's not as bad as I initially thought, because obviously Zerg does need to scout with their worker, and they use workers for structures. So it kind of just it doesn't really make a huge difference in terms of tempo. They're still spending their starting minerals, so I don't think it would be massive. It might just offset what the early game imbalance that Anansi is pointing to. It's just I'm not actually 100% sure how much of that, is the imbalance as grave as he thought? I think maybe not based on his sources, but also we just need to do some more diving into that, I think. But I'm certainly open to making changes in that corner, so I should point that out here. The other thing I was 100% sure about as far as changes go is whether or not the changes that I made to the Zealot and the Ecclesiast were going to be enough for Protoss Gateway to hold the line versus Zerg. But also, I think basically what it allows for is the Gateway units to be the bully damage dealer tank types, with Zealots having more shield armor now. It's only 1 more shield armor, but it's still a decent buff, especially when you consider the Ecclesiast in the picture. So now basically, I guess I should take a step back. So the Ecclesiast got an attack rate buff, and I think it's a non-trivial one in terms of their DPS, but also in terms of the fact that that's going to proc their heal over and over again. And some people think Ecclesiasts are really good. Some people think they're not so good. I think more people think they're not so good than the people who think that they are good. And then on the side of the Zealot, a lot of people think the Zealot is too weak. Although I feel like the Zealot has been pretty potent. So I'm not really sure why that assessment has been made. I feel like they have swung certain fights, especially when you're dealing with a ranged heavy composition that can't easily get away from them. I'm thinking things like quasis and stuff, especially since they obviously get double countered by armor. But the other thing that factors into that is obviously with Zethar cores having 2 armor pen, that was a sore spot where you didn't really have the ability to survive against the Zethar cores if they could surround and get good surface area on you. And maybe that should always be the case. But anyway, what I've done for now is make it so that as long as their shields hold, they effectively have 3 armor instead of 2, which is a funny way of saying that they have 3 shield armor and 2 normal armor. But that's a little bit harder to decouple in CMBW currently. And essentially that means that the Ecclesiast will be able to give them more effective armor for longer due to its attack rate buff, combined with the fact that the 3 armor actually does reduce the damage of the Zethar core from 4 to 3. So that's pretty significant because the Zethar core still has 2 armor pen. I didn't want to touch the Zethar core's armor pen because they basically just fall off immediately at that point instead of later on. I know that some people have mentioned that the pylons might be too squishy. I think maybe that's true, but also people like to get away with as few pylons as possible, and there's a certain point that comes where you should probably do a redundancy pylon. I don't know. There's like a lot of data that I still have to sift through, and especially on this new update, there's a lot of things that I have to consider. I wouldn't mind adjusting pylon stuff if I just give them 2 armor. That doesn't help them versus Zeths, obviously. If I make it so that the pylons have more HP, then maybe that could be the change instead, so that they take a little bit longer to go down. Like, I'm open to these things, especially since there was a patch a while ago where they became 75 minerals instead of 50. The reason being is that when they were only 50 minerals, people were just using them to like spam block everything, and like they were very liberal with the expenditure of resources there, and that's obviously no bueno. So I think instead what we'll end up doing is we'll see. We won't change the cost. We'll just see if we can change some details about the unit's stats on the durability side and see what happens there. And you know, that's something I'm open to doing, right? So the things so far I'm not 100% sure on. Was the Vorva core hit too hard? Is the change to the Skithra core tech path enough? By the way, the other thing that the Skithrock scab unlocks, I forgot to mention, pretty big deal. The Bactylisk is now a tier 1 morph. Again, it's similar to the Vorva core, but it's basically that for the Hydra. Now the Bactylisk has 1 armor instead of 2 and 110 HP instead of 120. I haven't changed anything else about it. I am almost certain that that is going to be really fucking strong. But you do need to spend 150 gas to get access to them, and then they are 50 gas a pop off of a Hydra, which did get buffed, so you should see a bit more of. But anyway, it's like a very gas-intensive playstyle, and I suspect that will probably be enough to balance it out. But also, you know, like, who knows, really? I don't actually know if, like, if this unit is going to be too oppressive in tier 1. We'll need more data on that, and specifically from, like, I want to see the Zerg versus Terran matchup, because versus Protoss, you can just start to navigate into artillery or like heavy melee, like amaranths and stuff. You can do that navigation a lot sooner. I think like golems with their shield passive are really good versus bounce attacks anyway. So like, you know, it feels like Protoss have the tools to deal with that, at least on paper. So I would like to see how Terran respond, because I feel like then you might start to see mech show up early. Instead, like, especially with the Fulcrum getting 50 minerals off of its cost, it's only 150 minerals now, as opposed to 200. So I feel like mech might start to become more favored, not just versus Protoss, but also like as a mid-game transition point, or middle of tier 1 transition point versus Zerg. But mech doesn't really have anything that I think can easily deal with Bactylisks. Maybe the Vulture, if you can dive on them. But, you know, like the Vulture can be pretty squishy too. So I don't know, like I might make the Bactylisk even squishier now that it is a tier 1 unit, just like the Vorva core. I might make it have 100 HP instead of 110, which would, by the way, mean that since the Hydra got buffed to 95 HP, that would mean that it only has 5 more health. It has no more armor. So, like, statistically, it's not that different. But, hey, you're still getting it from a Hydra at tier 1 because you have no Oxal Larva, right? So you can't, like, bypass the morph. So, you know, that factors into it, where you get your Hydra back after, and it is at a tier 1 point. So anyway, that's kind of interesting. Like, I've heard Shambler describe the Vorva core before as like a Zethra core missile, and I think like the Bactylisk is kind of like the opposite of that, where you have it in the back line, And then if it does get popped by people running up on it with like Legionnaires, or, I mean, that's kind of unrealistic because I feel like they'd be slapped by Bactylisks, but whatever, like they get run up on by melee or like combat drops of Hurricans and stuff, which also got changed, by the way. And then you end up seeing like just a lot of damage dealt or whatever. And then they turn into Hydras, and suddenly they're better at dealing with armored targets because they have they have 3 armor pen now instead of just 2. So like that's pretty big for the Hydralisk. So anyway, like these are all details that I'm gonna wait and see on, you know. But I think it's pretty cool to try that. It's basically giving Zerg more of a reason to stick to tier 1 for a bit longer and spend gas. That's one of the patch goals, actually, is to make it so that they don't feel like they have to stick to pool only because their tier 1 options suck. I didn't really believe their tier 1 options sucked. I think Skither cores were pretty good, specifically at being not very good for the game design. They were really good at just sniping all of your workers. If you weren't prepared, you can make like a sudden switch into it and basically just end the game versus like Protoss or Terran, right? So that feels pretty shit. Especially since, like, you know, Zerg in ZVZ, you wouldn't necessarily think to make them because you can just burrow. And it's like, yeah, okay, so Zerg have the tools to face off against that, but not really the other races. So I'm sure that was quite tilting. There's going to be other things coming, though. I mean, like the Lodestone obviously still exists. People don't necessarily use them too often, but you can put Cyprians in there, and that can help clean up versus things like Skiths. The Protoss will have a revision to the Matrix that'll make it a bit more on the defensive side. I think that'll help out quite a bit. And then, yeah, but I also think, like, you know, the Shroud is really good for the Zerg, giving you access to Lakizalisks and Gorgs. I think Zaristaliths are pretty underrated tanks, but for whatever reason, the people weren't building them very often. And then they started to, and at the end of Ascension number 7 playoffs, they started to do Lakizalisk pushes. I think maybe entirely because of what Anansi was doing, where Anansi was realizing, okay, he's experimenting. It's like he's new to it. So he tries the Shroud, and he tries to, you know, do these deadly pushes against Terran and Protoss. And yeah, he wins some games off of Nablime that way. He wins, I think, a lot of games off of Hapsea. I'm not 100% sure about that. But yeah, it's interesting, right? It was cool to see. And I feel like the Shroud was probably in an acceptable spot, and nothing changed about the Shroud or any of its units. But on the side of the Hydrith, then, I can understand why maybe Izira cores were thought of as too expensive. They are now 25 minerals cheaper. I can understand why Hydras were thought of as understated. They have more stats now. The Skither core, I'm not 100% sure on, but the Hydralisk is also buffed by having the Bactylisk in tier 1, because now the Skithrak Scab is like an option for you to add more value to your mass Hydra if that's what you've done. And I think Hydras can now be more thoroughly used to bust. So anyway, like Zerg just have more tools, hopefully, is the end result of this. But they have to invest into those tools and spend gas to get those tools, so they will be able to contest in tier 1 instead of feeling like they have to just bypass tier 1. I don't know if that feeling was even accurate to begin with, but I think that at the very least, like, something that happens when you buff a unit or you change something about a unit is people will naturally start to think about using them. Unless it was a nerf. If it was a nerf, then maybe they just don't use them for a while. Like, that's what happened with Wraiths, and then Nablime proved that Wraiths are still pretty damn good. So it's like, okay, well, whatever. I guess some people will just not use them for a while if it's a nerf. But I would like to see what happens in the sort of aftermath of all of these games, right? So we will wait and see. We'll continue our sort of musing and discussion on those particular things based on the data. But yeah, on the Protoss side, idols now have homing attack. Hierophants are changed in their cost to be 100 minerals and 75 gas is, oh no, I think that's what their old cost was. Let me go and pay. I think they're 125 and 50 now. Yes, they are indeed 125 minerals and 50 gas, so the website needs to be updated for that. Obviously, Ecclesias, as I mentioned, got an attack rate increase. Dracodon and Legionnaire are the same. Zealot obviously no longer has its movement speed increase, has increased base movement speed compared to before, but doesn't have the shield movement speed increase, and instead has the extra shield armor. So those are the changes for Tier 1 Protoss. So I touched the Zealot, Ecclesias, Hierophant, and Idol. I have not adjusted Simulacrum, Manifold, Vassal, Golem, Dracodon, and Legionnaire. Maybe those will get adjusted later. I did not adjust the Gateway or Lattice in terms of their costs or anything. So there you have it from that perspective. Again, the Matrix will be adjusted. That was not adjusted in the most recent update pass, so it's not complete, it's not conclusive. But yeah, there's definitely going to be some other details that kick into gear later. And of course, we're planning on adding more robotics units in the future as well, but that's a separate issue. On the Terran side, I finally made the Cataphract cost 6 transport space. That was something I should have done before the Ascension 7 tournament, to be honest, but just kept forgetting. Fulcrum 150 minerals, but no changes to any of its units. No changes to Starpad or any of its units. No changes to the Cyprian, Cleric, Shaman, or Vestry, and the Stockade stat cost are the same. The Maverick and the Hurakan were modified. The plan for flamethrower attacks in general, for Matador in deployment mode, Durandal, and indeed the Hurakan, is so that they make it so that they can't hit the same unit more than once. So they will still be able to attack in that cone and hit multiple units in an area, so they still have crowd control, but each attack will only be able to hit the same unit once. So they'll no longer like stack up more than once. And that means that we can basically normalize the way that the attack, the polyad adhesive stack occurs. And it's basically like, okay, it rends the armor, and like it's not going to stack up at different intervals, basically, depending on how many attacks you hit. So that will finally be corrected. That will allow Hurakans to be a lot more sane. They are larger by a small margin. They are much more durable with 2 armor instead of 1, now that they block Cyprian shots in TVT, by the way. They have 90 HP instead of 80, and they move a little bit slower. They move the same base movement speed as the Maverick is the current plan. I think they might actually be a little bit faster, but I couldn't figure out why that was, so I just left it for now. But yeah, there's that. And then, yeah, they just deal less damage. They have no more armor pen on their attack by default, which is kind of funny that that was even a thing to begin with. I think that was like vestigial from way back, and I just never adjusted it. They are still 1 transport space. That could change, but I'm very cognizant about the anchor. It's like if I take away your ability to put like Hurakan, Maverick, Cyprian into an anchor, then you might really struggle versus like Gate Toss or something. But, you know, like that the trade-off there is that the Trojan can still fit 8 of them in there. However, I think the unit will just be less useful as a like mass drop into somebody's base for tech snipes. You're going to need to mix in Mavericks, which are less durable and thus easier to snipe. So basically now, if you're on the receiving end of one of Niblime's tech torturing, then basically you can choose to either pick off the Hurakans, which is going to be a little bit less efficient, but it stops the armor rend, or you can pick off the Mavericks that are dealing most of the DPS because they're gated by the armor, right? And the Mavericks are easier to pick off, but they're ranged. So they might not be easier to pick off if he's microing them. But then on the side of the Hurakans, it's like, well, what are you going to do with that? If you just pick them off, then they attack a little bit faster now, so they can probably stack up the armor end better, but they just deal overall less damage to a significant degree versus buildings, because buildings would always take maximum number of hits, except for maybe the pylon. You could miss 1 attack on the pylon or something. It's just a weird, goofy system that Blizzard originally implemented that we need to re-implement and do the right way, in air quotes. So that's going to be done at some point. So I guess I'm not really 100% sure about the Terran state. I feel like they were just in an okay spot already, so I don't really need to fuck with them too much. But the Maverick changes were to make it so that stim pack only lasts for 5 seconds. So if you want to get across the map, you've got to stim like 3 times, whereas previously only really needed to stim pack once. And that, I think, is going to be, you're taking 3 times the damage. So you're a lot more vulnerable, right? If you're going to still do that move. I feel like it's going to be a lot harder to move across the map. And Anansi actually tried it, and compared to his past experiences with the other one, the other version, he realized, okay, yeah, he can't just spam Mavericks or whatever. So that seems like it has done the correct thing there, toned the stim pack timer down. And that's it. That's the only change I made to the Maverick. So with that said, I guess that's pretty much it as the rundown of the current changes. I think the most significant ones are definitely the Nathrok Lake and the Skithrock Scab, and like the resultant changes, like locking Nathrokor Vorvikor behind a tech sort of 1.5 wall. By the way, you can bypass the lake and go straight to the pool, or sorry, the pond, the Kalkir pond. You can go straight there to get all of the units. Like, it also enables the Nathrokor and Vorvikor, right? So if you end up building just a pool at, like, for some reason you went like Den first or whatever, then you might see, like, I don't think you'd ever see that, but like, for the sake of argument, you can say you go Den first and then you hit tier 2 and then you make a pool. You don't need the lake. You can go straight to the pond. So hopefully that makes sense. On the side of the Scab, it's the same deal. So if you start off with pool and then you go like pool Shroud into tier 2, then you make a Den and you can go straight to the swamp still and still get all of the units, right? So hopefully that all adds up to people's heads. I think it'll be a good change. I think it's unlikely to be bad. The only question is, how does Zergs adapt to that? And does it have enough of a requirement change? And also, does like the Hydrith Den into Skithrock Scab change? Like, really change everything. Because really what inspired me is that, like, Veek said that he voiced his complaint about the tech pacing in a way that I could actually understand, whereas previously he would just most of the time just say, like, well, at least the way that what I took from his comments in the past was always like, yeah, there's just no tech pacing. And I was like, well, obviously there is tech pacing, so I'm not really sure what this means. And then, like, I guess we, like, especially during the tournament, I just couldn't engage with people's complaints or feedback as healthily or as, like, straightforward with a lot of back and forth because I was still running the tournament. So it's like, okay, I don't have the spare processing power to do all this. So talk to me after the tournament, basically. Is I said that to many people about certain details. They're like, hey, let's wait until after the tournament, then we'll get to the bottom of all this. But indeed, like, the day after the tournament, we talked, and he mentioned that he thinks there should be a tell for when the enemy is going air units. And I had thought for a while, like, maybe the eggs should actually the larvae should turn into cocoons instead of eggs, or the eggs should be different colored for air units or something like that. But an even better tell, although maybe that should still happen, right? But, like, an even better option would be if the structure that they have made is mutating into a different structure, right? Like, if that's happening, then that's, like, a pretty good option, a pretty good sign that, you know, you're in a good spot. You can say, hey, you say to yourself, like, okay, dude, I know that this structure is becoming some other structure instead of they just mutated the structure, right? From a worker. So if the pool is already turning into something, it's done, it's full HP, but it's turning into something, you know, okay, they want to access Nathricores and Vorvicores. So I should prepare myself for those two options, right? And the same is true for the Hydras then. If it's mutating, you know, okay, they'll have access to Skithricores and Bactylisks. So these are, like, things, these are details, these are things you can rely on in some ways to, when you see that there will be that tell, right? There will be some information accrued because, you know, Protoss have the Stargate and the Lattice being the only tier 1 air without a tell. That's probably, like, the last remaining thing, right? With the Vassal is what I'm referring to. But everything else is like, okay, if you make a certain structure, I know you can do a certain thing, right? And so I think that's fine, generally speaking. Like, when you see a star pad, you know, okay, your Terran is going to be able to drop me or detect me or, you know, scout me or attack me with wraiths or whatever. If you see a lot of star pads, you know, okay, he's going mass wraith probably. Like, that's the only reason you make, like, 3 or 4 star pads. They're pretty heavy investment. Whereas on the Protoss side, it's like, okay, they could be making lattices for vassals, but they could also be making them for idols or for golems or, you know, any number of things, right? So they still have some flexibility there. But generally speaking, like, vassals are easier to deal with, right? And so, like, if vassals continue to be, like, a terror that is unmatched, then, like, maybe we change them around a little bit, right? Because, like, when Hapsea was getting up to a tempo advantage versus Hamster game 3 of the Elimination 2B match of Ascension number 7, he used vassals on Sideshow to get a lot of value, right? And he killed some workers and he, like, forced some sprites and stuff. And that's basically, like, the inverse of what Hamster had done in game 1 on Highwater, where he did the ridiculous Nathricor cheese. And it's like, okay, well, I don't want the game to be about air units. So how do we make it so that the air units arrive more gracefully, or at least, like, people can respond to them without gambling, right? That's the word that kept coming up, especially from Veek. It's like, how can we make it so that the opponent isn't trying to react to air units without knowing that air units are coming? And so now we have a tell. So I think that's, like, a good way to conceptualize it for the future, is like, do I know what my opponent is going to do? Like, how reasonable is the scouting requirement? And I still think you can do that. Like, you can just leave your scribe there, buy the eggs to see what's hatching. That's certainly what the Koreans do or even high-level, like, mid-level ladder players do in 1v1 against Zerg in StarCraft 1. So it's not like it's, for me, it's, like, the obvious thing to do. But I think it's probably fine to, considering you can get air a lot earlier, it's probably fine to have that gated by something that is more of an obvious tell. And then, you know, if you are able to sneak it somewhere or somehow, then more power to you. Then maybe you can surprise your opponent with a switch. So hopefully that has elucidated the reasoning and the current state of things. Of course, there's still some considerations, as I mentioned, like the larva, the Vorvicor, whether or not the Ecclesiast Zealot and stuff like that is in a good spot. So far, Gateway seems to be forcing Zerg to do some pretty significant military floods. So, like, they are still ahead in that sense. Like there's a game where Anansi was on 17 workers for a very long time, and then he just did a massive military flood. And the military flood was enough to overwhelm his opponent, but had his opponent held, he would have had no military because all of his next rounds were workers. And even then, up until that point, he was very, very behind in terms of economy. So that's like one case where it's like, yeah, if, it then becomes about like scouting the number of military that your enemy has done. I don't think people really know how to play against Anansi in general, by the way, because he makes like 6 macro hatches. It's like a ridiculous amount of production for Zerg in the early stages of the game. Like he really tries to pump those numbers up fast. But like that's just like one of the details, right? So anyway, hopefully that made some sense to people. As that has been our balancing section of this particular episode. And we are going to move on to a very exciting topic, at least it's near and dear to my heart. It is the Underclass Group Stage Tournament. Now, this tournament is going to be really cool because it's not about the Class 1s, it's not about the highest level, the heights of competition, as the previous episode had been titled, although somewhat tongue-in-cheek. It's not about all that. Instead, we're going to have our Class 2s and Class 3s take to the stage. We're going to have all of the fan favorites. We're going to have the people who, essentially like everybody who wasn't invited back, who will not be invited back, like everybody outside of the top 6 of the last tournament is certainly eligible. I mean, I think at this point, Veek is a Class 1, so I don't think I can necessarily say that he's eligible. He's obviously going to have an invite back as well. But like that's like one example. I was like trying to go through the people in my head. Like I kind of want to give Nuke Class 1, but he hasn't been playing that often, so I guess it would make sense to give him the opportunity. Sipiak is in there for sure. Like these are the kinds of people who I would say like there's certain players, if they decide to sign up for it, that would be construed as favorites for the way that things go, right? And it's like I think Sipiak is a top dog in that fight. I think Newt could be from the Terran representation. I'm trying to think of who would be a good Class 2 Protoss to root for, and I feel like it's probably like 3Crow or Biddy, right? But it feels like, well, I don't know. I was about to say it feels like Sipiak could just slap him around, and maybe Newt could too. But Biddy did cheese Sipiak. So I don't know. There's a head-to-head matchup rivalry between those guys. But anyway, we'll have a group stage only tournament. And maybe we'll take the winners of the matches and we'll do like an FFA or something. That could be an option. Like the winners of the groups will compete in a free-for-all. But that would involve like the winners still being online at that point. And I don't know that that's guaranteed. There won't be any money on the line. But we'll see how many people show up and how many groups we can even make out of that. Because we have a lot of Class 2 and Class 3 players, but I don't know how many would be interested in that sort of thing. I tried to get Lundier in on it, but he's like, he said something to the effect of like, just working at night never allows, he's never free for that sort of thing, which is that's just a shame, man. But that's all right. That's all right. He can play against Nablime and Anansi instead and really practice up his play. And with that, I don't know the details of when it's going to happen. I think it would make sense to have it be in between Christmas and New Year's. So I guess just keep your eyes peeled. I also wasn't even sure what to call it. Like when I came up with the name Crown Stalker, which is kind of like epic, but it's like, you're like trying to get that dub. You're trying to get get access to the goods, right? And that's really cool. But like these are the people who are aspiring. That's what also when I was thinking of like the aspirants or just call it Aspire or something like that. I don't know. But like I don't know. I'm not even really decided on the name. Crown Stalker seems to be the top dog. But I don't know. Tell me what your thoughts are on the name. What should the title be? You tell me. We'll outsource that. We'll crowdsource that just like Frost Giant Studios crowdsource their game design. And I guess we can move on to the immediate focuses for December's second half. This is another sort of quickie. So something actually that Veek just DM'd me a little bit recently was something about, he added a new UI feature, which was basically just that if you hold Alt while selecting a single unit, you will see the damage it has dealt and the damage it has taken over its lifespan. And that's really cool because that's something that Mesk and I were talking about. I was saying that it would be really nice to know how much damage this one, engram did. And so it's like, an alternative version of kills, basically. And I think that's really, really neat, nice information. But beyond little, quality of life buffs like that. That's mostly useful for like casters, I think. I mean, maybe it can be useful for players in the moment as well. But we do have like a whole Trello card about the under the roadmap and goals section. We have this Trello card that we want to end up adjusting, and definitely one of them is like improving installation and update. We want to improve the UX and customization. I would say like it's probably a reasonable goal. I mean, I'd have to talk with Vik about this, but it would probably be reasonable to try to finish the implementation of tabbing in the context of being able to tab through multiple units and stuff. There's some requirement related bugs that we have to figure out, and then there's some other details that we should definitely try to iron out as well. And there's all sorts of details like that. That would be really nice. I'm going to continue working on AI and content. In fact, my stream for when on the day that this episode drops, I plan a stream where I'll be working on some tutorial stuff. And that will obviously involve working on some AI as well. So you'll see both of those things be worked on pretty soon. Let's see. There's a lot of things on this list. So I guess I would just say, we'll probably just maybe we'll also try to knock off the Nexus power field. That's like a technical limitation. I can probably talk with DF about that actually, but I know that Vik had said that he would be happy to work on it. It's a question of his time, of course. So we'll see who ends up getting to that first, I suppose. Definitely want to fix up a couple of other bugs and continue to add more features, of course. I think that some of Niblime's replay feature wish list are definitely possible. Some of them are just bug fixes, like fixing the speeds. I believe that's AI debug that could be hand-holding that, but it could also be... Yeah, I think it is. I think it's AI debug fucking that up. Inability to pause, for example. And then shift tab for player colors is also another option. It's like just broken somehow, and I don't actually know what's breaking that, to be honest with you. So that'll require some stuff. So... Also, it would be nice to implement the seeking behavior where you can just click and it'll replay the game from scratch at a maximum speed. I feel like it wouldn't be too fast, unfortunately, because obviously the game just has a lot going on in it. And when you hold plus in AI debug, it doesn't, using AI debug's feature to hold plus to speed the game up, it doesn't actually go that fast at the end of the day. But maybe we can make it go even faster. Like maybe there's some built-in limiter or something related to how fast it goes when you speed it up through that. I'm not sure, but we'll have to see. And then... I don't know. There's a bunch of little things, and most of it is just fixes, but some of it is actually new behaviors, rather new features. And so we'll see how many of those we can knock off the list. Definitely want to do things like the Nexus thing. Definitely want to do things like, eventually, like longer term, right? There's still like iScript extension and other details. But as far as December's second half goes, I think more progress on tabbing, some progress on the Nexus power field, and some of those replay feature wish list things where we fix up some details and some bugs, I think would be very welcome. And that's pretty much it. So you know what time it is, boys? Time to ask those coffee questions. This is where I make the real money, big dollars, and if you want to add those big dollars, I am actually looking for bounties right now. Obviously, it's Christmas time, it's holidays. Everybody's money is a little strapped, but I am also strapped. So if you want to make it so that I'm less strapped, then and you have the funds to spare, you can put me to work. You just tell me what you want. We'll come to some kind of conclusion and some kind of agreement on what to prioritize. So I do appreciate that if you can spare it. And otherwise, I appreciate all the people who are asking questions, starting off with the Shambler, who asks, what are the various roles of females in, and then he lists a bunch of things. I've summed up his list. This is the same question as the last episode, but he's asked it again, asking for basically the rest of the stuff that I didn't talk about. He talks about Githrovan, Daasir, which are the Daasir are the slaves race, basically the elevated hominids that are under control of the Makral and or the Makralon rather. So that's what makes the Makral, right? The hyphenated regency. Githrovan being the sunspawn that are most analogous to Pr0totype, but not quite. That's like just the easiest way to think about them, I guess. For if you're not initiated in the setting, the Embra Cyt, which is a coalition of lesser races, including the which will be featured in CMBW next year, the Keltar and the Oros. Those were the ones that he had posted in a YouTube comment in the last episode, and so I've listed them all here so that I can go through them nice and easy. Now, I don't know why he's so obsessed with females, but, I would always tell you guys that the Twitch TOS got rolled back, so if you're looking for your adult content, you might have to go to an adult content site. No, obviously, this is like world building stuff. The Githrovan females are... the Githrovan are definitely more of an egalitarian society than what I'd talked about in the past. They don't have like child rearing in the same way. So I'm not even really sure if it makes sense for them to have females to begin with. But assuming I do go the way of them having females, then they would very much just be kind of like, I guess like more pensive, probably a little bit more like their males are the ones that are very idealistic. And their males are the ones that can sometimes be led astray by a sense of duty or purpose. And the females are a little bit more on the side of like, so far that as I've written them, they're more on the side of the cynic in that sense, which I don't think is like, I don't think it's been represented that way per se. But this is all by and large, generalization anyway. So that's sort of the way that I would look at it is like the Githrovans are the ones that try to, the female Githrovan try to steer the ship in a way that doesn't result in them getting overwhelmed by, whatever the negative knock-on effects could be about like being super naive, essentially. But their naive sense of purpose is what actually gives them a lot of their sense of purpose in general. If you look at their, intended, like the commencement and stuff, they want all of that stuff to be, they want a universe at peace. They want a universe that doesn't have all of this fighting all the time. And so like that is kind of like an idealistic concept in and of itself, just at its core. So of course you would kind of expect the Githrovans then to have that. And so I wouldn't, when I say that the Githrovan females are more cynical, I don't mean that they like spit in the face of any of this stuff. It's just like they try to bring these people back down to earth, so to speak. They try to, they try not to do too much about the, like let it get into their heads or like over their head, I guess. They it's very easy to get overwhelmed if you just follow that to the ends of the earth, so to speak. So that's sort of the role of the Githrovans is like the sense making, like the males kind of by and large drive the engine of progress in some ways. I know that sounds cursed as fuck, but you'll have to divorce it from modern day equivalents. They're the ones that are the like getting behind, like they're often the ones serving in the war, for example, various conflicts and stuff, trying to do peacekeeping. And the females are the ones that are, there are female soldiers and stuff, but the idea is by and large, they're the ones that are a little bit more realistic about the outcomes and aren't as surprised when things don't go their way, perhaps. The Daasir, women are just slaves, just like the males. There's not really a civilization or society in that sense because they're not elevated enough to have one. So that's sort of like, you could, not the same thing as like the great apes of the, I almost said of America, of the earth. I always called the whole world the America. That's how American I am. If you think about like the great apes that are like the society, or even like just general chimpanzees and stuff too, it's like the females do have their own roles and there is a society in that sense, but it's not like the same level. So I almost don't even know if it's worth talking about here, but yeah, like they don't have the cognition, they don't have the cognitive capabilities to engage in that kind of society on the same level of like a spacefaring civilization for sure. I'm not even 100% sure if they'll speak, like I'll put it to you that way. So as a result, like, if I decide to go with the angle that they don't speak, then, well, they probably aren't going to have really complex gender roles. Only whatever their evolution had, and then only what was guided to them by the Macrolon, right? And that would just be what's useful for the war effort. The Embra Cyt, though, this spreads across multiple different races. The Retons are a very classical, like, standard fare, I guess. It's I guess a bit more egalitarian than maybe something like the Keltar, or the definitely more egalitarian than the Macrolon, as I had mentioned them in the past. But I guess they're probably a little bit closer to the Ancifi. They don't have this built-in drive to expand the empire or go across the cosmos and travel, but the Retons are very numerous, so there's a lot of them. They're a prolific species when it comes to their population, and so that generally is going to lead to like more child rearing roles for the females and stuff, right? So that's where I say that's probably, honestly, like, I know the Ansifi have taken the cake as like the human analog, but the Retans aren't that far away from that either. Their physiology is a bit different. So anyway, that's definitely something to think about. And I wouldn't be surprised if if that ends up being like something that people look at as kind of a bog standard one. For the Ascosi, not so far away from the Githrovan example, but obviously the males are not like that. They're not idealistic or whatever. Generally, the Ascosi are a very cunning species, and they're quick to anger. So the females are a little bit less quick to anger, not by much, but enough to make a difference, and enough for it to be noted. And they often are a little bit more socially attuned. So what I mean by that is they can more often be diplomatic. They're usually better spoken. And again, like, a part of that is down to having a bit more control of their temper, which I know that's going to make some people laugh if they have their own minds made up about how human women are. But the Ascosi have that dynamic going for them in the opposite sense, where the males are a lot more about conquest and stuff, which is kind of familiar, but in a sense where it's like it's not necessarily well thought out, or if it is well thought out, it's often not very like. It's not presented as such, right? It's presented very off the cuff. So, sometimes the Ascosi are like very aware. Again, they're cunning, right? So they're aware of their outward sort of appearance and how they come across, and they often use that. But a lot of it's sort of like, this is a funny analogy to draw upon. It's like Artosis is like angry on stream. Some percentage of that anger is performative, and some percentage of that anger is fucking real. And it's hard to say what the ratio is, but that's kind of how you can imagine the Ascosi, right? So that's sort of what the males and females both leverage. But the females are often the ones that maybe reference their species being quick to anger, and they might be like, I am, as an Ascosi sort of matriarch or whatever, I'm a little bit more, understanding of any sort of trifling that you might do to my kind, but you have to understand that if I present this to the other members of my species, they will take this as disrespectful. And you don't really want to disrespect a Ascosi. You know how quick to anger they often are. I don't know, some shit like that, right? They can be manipulative, and they can definitely be cunning in a more bureaucratic way than the males often can. The males are more cunning when it comes to strategy and raiding and doing all this other stuff, as they've had to be in order to survive. But the females are a lot more on the social side as opposed to the war side, right? So battle tactics, you leave it to the men usually. The females are the ones that are going to help you figure out how to navigate into the the roles of bureaucracy and politics and deal making and stuff like that, right? So those are those two anyway, right? Reeton and Ascosi are covered out of the Embra Cyt. I haven't really discussed much about the Pr0totype yet, so I'll keep that under wraps. And obviously there's the Daasir, and there's a couple of others. I'll refer back to those when I've got more written for them. The Keltar and the Oros were what to wrap this up. The Keltar, the females are very much often like shamans and oracles and stuff. They're religious leaders, you could think of them as, very much in the sense of like, obviously there's like the whole fertility angle, but the Keltar do have live births, so there's that angle, but then they also have a lot of reverence for the divine feminine, and they will definitely be very protective of their women as a result. But you can expect the females to help sort of guide the Keltar along the right path in some ways. I guess it's kind of analogous to the way I described the Ascosi, but it's not like manipulative. It's like if it's manipulative at all, it's like manipulating the other Keltar, but in a way that's like, helping them to have a clear mind about things. Because Keltar also have battle fury. They also see red when they're angry, and it's not always a cunning thing, right? It's very often that's just their sort of birthright, as it were, their heritage at work. And so, yeah, it's definitely something to think about there. But the women are spiritual leaders, religious leaders. They are not often in positions of power when it comes to diplomacy or politics or whatever, but they're not necessarily like heads of state, right? They're definitely not that. There's almost always like an emperor at the head of the Kens, the various Kens. They have their own word for emperor, but I forgot it off the top of my head. Or maybe I never actually made it, but I intend to have their own word for that. But either way, the females are not the ones, right? So, but they are very much like trusted advisors. They are very much, like I don't think you'll ever see them on the battlefield again, owing back to the protective nature of the males in that sense. But they are a precious sort of, I guess, like a resource that is depended upon, right? So they're very much something that the other Keltar appreciate, and they have their own very highly sought after roles as a result. And the Oros, well, the Oros are a little bit underwritten, I would say. So the only thing I can tell you about the Oros females is that, there's obviously the angle of, yet again, fertility and stuff, but as opposed to live births, it's, they're lizards, so there's eggs. But when it comes to other roles in their society, I was playing around with the idea of the Oros having mostly female engineers, or like maybe repair specifically, like, I was going to say repairmen, but that's funny. The reason being that the Oros have different, I was basically playing around with the idea that the males of the Oros might have different capacities than the females do when it comes to the control over electrokinesis, right? So their electrokinesis powers are basically like, the males might be better at, raw power and maybe certain other attributes and activities, and the females might be better at like more precise, nimble movements, right? By and large. And so if I decide to go that route, then you might see the females be more about the repairing side and like, subtle jobs and maybe stealth action and stuff. But the males would then obviously have complete domain over the more powerful options, right? And so like that might be a clever thing to do on a genetic level of why one of the ways that being male or female like changes how the any given Oros like actually interacts with their electrokinesis, right? So you might see stuff like that. But other than that, I don't actually have a definitive answer on that one yet. Not as interesting as the others because I haven't written that much about the Oros yet. Hopefully that was enough for the Shambler to be satisfied. He knows all about the woman now. Now he just needs to know about human woman. Oh, shit. Just kidding, dude. Hope you're doing well. Myrian asks, how much in-universe racism will feature in your work? So there's actually a bit more to this question. It was a funny question to read, just in general. He said, what do we have here? How much fictional racism will feature in your works? Will interspecies racism be utilized in telling stories in the No Frauds Club future works that is planned for the No Frauds Club? So, it's not a bad question, honestly, because othering people is something that people have done for a long time. And so it stands to reason that would absolutely be happening, especially among the races of Xibalba and other stuff that maybe aren't the most elevated sociologically. Maybe they aren't Githrovans, right? Although the Githrovans have their own prejudices, but usually it's against like non-life. Like they might be prejudiced against Thruk and Roselium. Or maybe they're even prejudiced against the Orlithrae because of their all-consuming nature, or Gadamemter for the same reason. But they might not be prejudiced, like they're not going to be prejudiced against like the Embra Cyt races for being lesser. Like Macrolon, they are 100% prejudiced against other races and think of them all as lesser. But it's not like one specific one, right? It's all of them. So I don't know if you can really count that as racism in the same sense. It's definitely like a discrimination / prejudice thing where they elevate themselves, but it's because they elevate themselves and not because they think of specifically like one other race as or a couple of other races as like, beneath them or whatever. It's almost like delusional for the Macrolon, right? Like they would look at the Cathethrons, which are like other extra dimensional entities in some way. And they'd be like, yeah, but we're better. And it's like, okay, well, you're just kind of fucking wild. And so, you got to admire the gusto, but I don't think it's a racist thing. At least that's not where my mind would jump to. Maybe that means I'm racist. You never know. But the way that the other ones would go, like there's definitely, there's like feuds that owe back to like, the Ansifi are definitely not fond of the Keltar. Like that's one, and maybe the Keltar vice versa. Although I think the Keltar probably just think of the Ansifi as like worthy battle opponents, but the Ansifi have like definitely othered and demonized the Keltar, and so that's like a case where you might see racism crop up. But it's like it's because of military conflict, so it's not like they were peacefully coexisting or one of them slaved the other or whatever. I mean, maybe it's always the case that like that kind of discrimination initially stems from, you know. Sort of like what the Macrolon were doing, where they thought of themselves as superior to anybody else. Maybe that's how it starts, and then it evolves into, you know, oh well, we have this like past misgivings with the people of this area, and so we're going to be racist against them or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a sociologist, so I have no real idea. I couldn't tell you how the building blocks start, but if we were going to go that route, then that's maybe you could consider that, right? It's like, again, stemming from past conflict, and they just choose to use the various different tools that they have at their disposal to other the other person, right? So that's definitely a thing. Like there will be, you know, different, I guess, there will be different ways to refer to them as. Like I honestly, this is funny. For the divine primacy in Cosmonarchy Brood War, there were going to be Terrans fighting them that referred to the zealots or the various units of the divine primacy, the various Protoss there, as primates. And I remember thinking that's kind of funny because it's like, you know, primacy. So like that's where they were from, and they would talk about it pretty frequently, right? And so it's like we got primates over here, and like that's not really, obviously that's not like a racist remark, but it's like a label. It's not even a slur. It's just like it's like a shorthand. It's sort of like referring to Zerg as roaches or whatever in that fucking weird Legacy of the Confederation campaign. It's like, well, then they called the fucking structure Zerg House. Oh my god. Oh, save me. But beyond Zerg House, it's like there's certain shorthands that people will have for each other, and it's pretty, I think that's like fine. Like it's interesting world building. It's kind of what people would do. And so the more human-like a particular race or regency is, you know, you might actually see that depending on the level of general social growth that a given civilization has accrued over time. You might see that kind of reaction. Now, I don't think the Macrolon are going to necessarily do that because they just sneer at everybody. But like the Ansifi would probably have like a clever catchphrase or something for some way to regard or refer to the Keltar as, because they just have that rivalry between the two races. And it's like, okay, well, that's a thing. So maybe that's just how it works, right? But yeah, I don't know if you count that as racism. You'll have to use your own judgment there, Myrian. But hopefully that sheds some more light on some details that you might see in the future. And a topical response follow-up question. Lucifirius asks, what is Ackmed's favorite slur? And this is a real short one, Lucy. Clowny. If you know, you know. 3Crow asks, do you foresee any Xibalba regencies having specialist units that fulfill leadership roles? And then he adds, for example, an Ansifi officer whose behavior revolves around supporting allies by giving orders, in air quotes, which could apply to all units within earshot or radius, or as an ability, apply effect to a group or singular unit. So I haven't thought about this as like a specific mechanic, but I do know that if I go to for example, the Keltar, and I'll have to plug this in I don't have it in my like recent history or whatever. So let me jump into that now. The Keltar have a unit that specifically is supposed to be like a standard bearer for them. And it is called the Banner Hand, funnily enough. And it has, it's just got a passive. It doesn't have an active ability. But basically, it basically shares a defensive barrier around allies, and then if it dies, any shields that are still on their allies are consumed to be healing, to turn into healing. So it's like that's a concept that's like basically a support unit that is a radius in nature. And so I have concepts of things like that. I think maybe the Ansifi had something kind of similar, but I might be reaching for that one. I know there was a constable. It's just called infantry leader, but yeah, it's actually it's just like it's got a firewall moving secondary weapon or whatever. So it's not actually like there's no behavior related to it, but yeah, I don't know, like focusing the player around like aura effects and radial effects and stuff would be cool. I don't know if it would ever be an active ability as opposed to something that procs under certain circumstances. It would probably depend on the scale of the given project. Like we probably want like a smaller scale project for our first game, as opposed to, Xibalba, the RTS that's going to be set there because it's not going to be called Cosmonarchy. I've made that decision a while ago. Vika agreed with that approach as well. He was like, yeah, we should probably rename it. So because Cosmonarchy is taking off as a Brood War mod, you probably don't want to reuse the same term for the retail game, right? And when we originally called it that, it was CMBW was just going to be like a quick proof of concept. It wasn't going to be what it turned into. But anyway, looking ahead to the way that the Xibalba stuff is set up, yeah, I'm not sure. Like I definitely could see this happening for Keltar because they have like lower unit counts in general. Whereas the Ansifi are going to have comparable unit counts to like CMBW Terran most likely. And I'm not talking about like unique units on the tech map. I'm talking about like unit counts in the game. Like how many units do you make, right? And I think it makes more sense for like the Keltar and the Githrovan. So you can probably look out for that there because they will just generally have lower unit counts. And so it would make sense then for at least one, if not both of those regencies, to have something like that. So do I foresee it happening? Yeah, probably. I'm not exactly sure how it will take shape, but it is something that I am considering. I feel like the way that I'm currently seeing it, I don't know that I would do the like within earshot thing, but it could be like an inspire thing or whatever. But again, it might be a passive as opposed to an active. Like if it's an active ability, then it probably would be like a target an area and then like everybody in that area gets some sort of benefit. Maybe you like plant a flag when you push a button and or something like that, right? And like when that happens, the unit maybe is like individually weaker. Like the banner hand might like plant a flag and lose one part of its passive, but like it provides an aura boost to everybody in the area. And or maybe it's like almost like a deployment. Like he plants the flag and holds it there. And so you can't move the unit anymore, but like while that's active, he gets a boost or something like that, right? That might be something that you do. Just as like spitballing some ideas. But yeah, it's definitely something that I am open to the idea of. I'll say that much. So thanks for your question. Alexhandr comes in as we're about to end the show with one final question here. And he says, tier list of Xibalba regencies from most based to most cringe. Well, I did do a tier list for pizza toppings as requested by Lucifirius, but I don't actually have all of the Xibalba regencies in a neat like tier list document. So yeah, I'm not going to be able to do that for like visually for you. But as far as most based to most cringe goes, that's a tough one. I guess it's probably inevitable that the Mackerel DOS would be seen as... okay, first of all, we need some definitions, right? Like, I get based... in my mind means something different, I think, than what it means to Alexhandr. Because when I think of based, I think of like something that is vaguely red pilly in nature or like right of center, but also like maybe driven to a ridiculous example or like an extreme, not something that's like actually epic. Like I wouldn't use it to unironically call something amazing usually. I guess sometimes I probably do, but in those terms I should probably say epic instead, because based usually to me is like a based meme would be something that's like I don't know, women go back to the kitchen or whatever. I don't know, some shit like that, where it's like, I don't actually believe that women only belong in the kitchen. I mean, they also belong in the bedroom, duh, but like, there's differences there where it's like, that's like a very extreme thing. And I almost think of it as like sarcastic or ironic or tongue in cheek. And so that's what based means to me. I assume that that's not exactly how it's being, because it's being contrasted against cringe. And I guess like cringe would be like the left of center blue pill antithesis, right? So it's like, I don't know, what's like a really like kind of like tongue in cheek, like I can't believe anybody would actually believe this thing, but like from the a more like liberal, socially liberal thing as opposed to socially conservative position or whatever the fuck. I don't know. That's sort of how my brain breaks it down right now. So I'm sure he might have some choice words for that. He might call me a noob in the comments actually. But anyway, we get I would have to say that like there's certain regencies that are absolutely cringe because they're like, just socialist or whatever, or closer to socialist. So that would be like the Embra Cyt for sure is kind of cringe. I don't know if they're the most cringe. I think most cringe might be Get 'em Enter, right? because it's like absolutely like everybody must become one thing. So that there's no individuality under that circumstance. So yeah, get rid of that. That's cringe. Or Lethray also, no originality. Hive mind, that's cringe. Get him away. And then you go to the Embra Cyt. Maybe you go to Rosellium as like the third most cringe, right? And because then they're like, kind of lame. I mean, they're not even alive, so that's kind of cringe. I would say the Embra Cyt might be fourth most cringe, like maybe that's true. I don't know. I don't want to be too hard on the guys, but they have that whole like, we're too weak individually to fight, so we have to join together. So that's kind of wild. I don't know. Like after that, I feel like most things are kind of mid-table, where there's not really that much cringe. Or maybe Githrovan would be fifth most cringe because of their really like ridiculously idealistic sort of outlook on life and what they want to do. That might be that. Maybe Nadarasatha. And yeah, maybe Nadarasatha would be the next most cringe. Although I kind of think Pr0totype might overtake them, mostly because they're timeless and like they just can't die, and so they're super edgy, and that's kind of cringe. So I guess it's Pr0totype. Actually, so I'll swap this out. I'll say Pr0totype are fourth most cringe, Embra Cyt fifth, Githrovan sixth, and then Nadarasatha seventh. And I guess that probably leaves us with, there's a number of them that are just neutral that I can't actually sort out into based territory. So that would be, let me look through this list. That would be the Thruk, because they don't even have a society or anything. I put Rosellium in the cringe standpoint because they're going to end all life, but the Thruk don't really care about that. So that's fine. Cathethrons as well, probably in the same territory there. Avot, because they're just energy entities, right? And then I want to say, okay, so the Solar Throne are kind of based because they're just like ridiculous. They're basically just like internet trolls, but an entire regency. Makral Daasir are based because they got slaves and they think that's cool. So that's like where the tongue-in-cheek part comes in. Delventhos are based because they went away and just turned inward and said, fuck this gay earth. So that's pretty, like, that's based territory. Keltar are obviously based because they have their, like, warrior culture and they hold on to religion and stuff. And Sifi are kind of based. I guess they're kind of mid, honestly. Yeah, they're probably, like, mid as well. I mean, they're not, like, cringe or based, right? So, yeah, that's probably, I mean, I guess they're based because they're, like, giant blue aliens and they fight. They're, like, they'd probably be, like, the sixth most based or something. I don't know, like, kind of, like, low on the based territory, the base totem pole. Kolopazos are probably the most based because they're like extra dimensional internet trolls. So the Solar Throne were like internet trolls that were made there, but like the Kolopazos are like extra dimensional ones. So they must be like the most based, right? And then yeah, so I guess you would probably sort it like Kolopazos most based. After that, it's probably it's kind of a tough one, isn't it? I guess it would probably be like Psychora second most based because they literally invaded another dimension to get more resources. So that's like colonialism and whatever. And then I guess it would probably be like Keltar because of their whole setup that they've got going on. Delventhos because they just abandoned the gay earth. The gay earth theory, by the way, that's better than the flat earth theory. I guess it's not even really a theory though. Not anymore. Yeah, what else do we have? I guess I don't know. That's probably a good enough answer. I feel like that's most of them. Like a lot of the ones that I didn't name specifically, like Rune, Omindris, Oros. They're just kind of they're not really that based. I guess Rune are kind of based because they just like eat everything and just like try to kill everything. That's like a very goofy thing, right? So that's kind of based too. All right, so hopefully Alexhandr got his money's worth out of that question. That was kind of a shit show because I didn't really have like an easy way to visualize the ranking. But at least I gave some thoughts on what I think is based or cringe about the given regency. So there you go. That brings us to the show outro. Thanks everybody for their financial support and their moral support and their temporal support. They dedicated their time, right? So I appreciate everybody who has played Cosmonarchy Brood War, participated in tournaments, participated in just random games, and given me their thoughts. And it's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool project, and I'm glad that people are taking to it. Of course, we'll be back with more episodes of this show next week, and more stuff throughout the month. So stay tuned for more streams and announcements, and have a happy holidays if I don't catch you before then. GG's.